It started with silence, that unnatural kind of quiet that only falls after a confession has been buried in the soil for too long. The early morning mist hung low across the grounds of Mayhew Hall, clinging to hedgerows and curling under old stone steps like a secret. Ernie Fletcher, the estate's gardener for over 40 years, moved slowly, deliberately, as if each rose he pruned was part of a prayer. But that morning, his hands hesitated. At the base of the ash grove, a part of the garden avoided by birds and, curiously, by children, Fletcher's trowel struck something unexpected. Not rock, not root, something softer, and yet unnervingly solid. He knelt, cleared the earth, and uncovered a single leather glove, black, worn, and too clean for how deep it had been buried. He stared at it for a long moment before sliding it into his coat pocket. Fletcher did not tell anyone. Not Lady Agnes, not the steward, not even Miss Hartnell, who passed him on the way to the glasshouse. He simply wiped his hands on his apron and returned to his shed. But something had shifted. That part of the garden, the forgotten ash grove, seemed to breathe differently now, as though something underneath had started to wake. Fletcher did not sleep that night. The glove sat on his desk beneath the shed's cracked window, its damp leather darkened further by the flicker of a candle stub he had let burn down too low. There was something about it, not the glove itself, but its placement in that soil, as though it had been offered, not lost, like it wanted to be found. He tried to write it off. Perhaps one of the young lads had been careless. But deep down, Ernie knew better. That part of the garden hadn't been touched in years. Not since Eleanor. By morning, the household stirred with a strange unease. Lady Agnes stood in the corridor in her pale blue house robe, speaking little, her voice thinner than usual. Her daughter Helena drifted through the breakfast room and out again, leaving her tea untouched and her gloves behind. Even the servants moved differently, with glances exchanged in polished surfaces and conversations cut short when someone entered the room. Miss Marple arrived just past 10, under the polite excuse of returning a borrowed recipe book. She had not been invited, but then, people like Miss Marple did not wait for invitations. They observed. She noticed the silver tray in the hallway, polished but missing one teacup. She noticed the dust-free lid of the piano in the east drawing room, an instrument no one had played in years. And she noticed Lady Agnes's posture when Helena entered the room, not maternal, not warm, but tight, as though bracing for something unsaid. Fletcher stayed silent, but after supper, under fading light, he returned to the ash grove and looked toward the sundial near the center, the one no one ever wound anymore. He knelt, pressed his fingers into the earth where the glove had been, and found a second depression. Something else had been buried nearby, something removed or taken. He looked toward the windows of the hall, where a figure had just drawn back a curtain. He could not see the face, but he felt its weight. Watching. It was Helena who found it. The day had been overcast, the sort of gray that drains warmth from stone and memory alike. She had been wandering without purpose, as she often did when the house felt too loud in its silence. Drawn by something vague, she slipped into the west corridor, a forgotten wing with shuttered windows and covered furniture, where time seemed to collect like dust. Behind a velvet curtain, she felt the edge of something solid. Curious, she pulled the fabric back, and her breath caught. It was a portrait, but not like the ones that lined the family staircase in proud symmetry. This one had been hidden, and worse, its eyes were gone. Not faded, not cracked, scratched out. Helena stared at it. The woman's face, even disfigured, carried a haunting grace, auburn hair pulled back with ribbons, mouth set in a half-smile that spoke neither joy nor fear. But it was the absence of eyes that made Helena's stomach turn, as if someone had tried to erase not just the likeness, but the very act of being seen. She didn't scream. Instead, she recovered the portrait and stepped back slowly, as though something might lurch out from the canvas. Behind her, a floorboard creaked, but it was only the shifting house. That evening at tea, Miss Marple noticed Helena's hand tremble slightly as she lifted her cup. She also noticed that when the name Eleanor was mentioned casually by the cook, recounting some old lace she believed had once belonged to her, Lady Agnes stiffened, her jaw tightening with visible restraint. The name was never acknowledged. In the village, Whispers had begun to resurface. Eleanor, the sister-in-law who had once filled the hall with music, had disappeared nearly 20 years ago. Some said she had run off mad. Others hinted at disgrace, perhaps a quiet institutionalization abroad. But Miss Marple knew that in places like St. Mary Mead, stories don't vanish, they're buried, folded under formal dinners, pressed beneath respectable smiles, and eventually painted over. And yet, someone had remembered enough to scratch her eyes away. The rain came heavy that night, not in sheets, but in slow, deliberate drops, as though the sky itself mourned something it could not name. The house creaked under the weight of it. Somewhere near the greenhouse, a gutter moaned loose from the side of the wall. No one noticed. No one but Fletcher. He had not returned home. His lantern was found leaning against the potting bench, still filled with oil, its wick untouched. It was Helena who saw it first from her window, a flicker where no light should be. Something about it felt wrong. By dawn, the lower garden paths were slick with mud. One of the younger gardeners, Jack, barely 20 and too green for secrets, reported a strange smell near the foundation of the old greenhouse. The ground there had sagged slightly, soft from rot. When he pressed his boot against the edge, it gave way, and something pale caught the morning light. Miss Marple arrived not long after. No one had called for her. They never did. But the village spoke in ways a telephone never could. The floorboards beneath the greenhouse storeroom were pried open with care. A void waited below, not deep but damp. Within it lay the remnants of something once tucked carefully away, a length of crimson velvet ribbon, stiff with age but still tied in a perfect bow. Beside it, pressed into the earth as if placed by a shaking hand, was a second glove, this one newer, deliberately cleaned, and tucked just beneath, a fragment of paper with only 2 letters still legible. Oh. Lady Agnes was informed, though no one quite remembered who told her. She appeared at the edge of the garden moments later, her shawl drawn tight, her voice unreadable. "I don't recognize any of it," she said, but her eyes lingered too long on the ribbon, and her fingers, always steady, clenched once before disappearing into her sleeves. Helena remained silent, but her gaze fell to the earth as if it were speaking to her. And Marple, she looked not at the items, but at the ground around them. "There's more under here," she murmured, almost to herself. "Not just things. Stories." And for the first time in decades, the garden felt restless, as if something long buried had begun to shift. The garden had turned quiet again, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after someone tells half the truth. That afternoon, the air hung thick and heavy, like a curtain no one had the courage to pull aside. Even the birds, so common near the rose arch, kept their distance from the ash grove. Helena walked alone. Her steps were slow, not hesitant, but deliberate, like she was retracing a path walked long ago in someone else's shadow. Miss Marple followed, not with stealth, but with the subtle distance only she knew how to keep. She said nothing, not until Helena herself turned to speak. "She didn't leave," Helena said suddenly, her voice quiet, almost lost in the wind. Marple tilted her head slightly. "Eleanor." Helena nodded, eyes fixed on the bench beneath the twisted ash branches. They made it look like she ran, but she didn't. "She was here, longer than anyone knows." "And you?" Marple asked gently. "How long have you known?" Helena didn't answer right away. She crouched near a patch of wild moss, fingers brushing aside damp leaves. Beneath them was a small, rusted brooch, shaped like a treble clef. Faded now, dulled by years of weather and neglect. "She used to wear it when she played," Helena said. "The violin. Every morning. I would sit by the door just to listen, but they hated it. Said it was inappropriate. Unladylike." Her voice cracked faintly, then steadied. "She played anyway. That's what made them furious." Miss Marple sat quietly on the bench, letting Helena's words settle like dust across polished wood. "What happened to her, Helena?" Helena exhaled slowly, not relief, but resignation. "I don't know exactly. I was young, too young, but I remember the music stopped, and no one said why. One day the piano was locked, her room cleared, and all I got was silence." "Sometimes," Marple said, Silence is louder than screams. Helena stood, brushing dirt from her palms. She looked toward the house, toward the tall windows of the drawing room, where Lady Agnes could sometimes be seen watching, always watching. "She still hears it, you know," Helena said quietly. "That music. It plays when it rains." Marple glanced toward the sky, where the clouds had begun to gather again, soft gray against a deeper blue. "Perhaps," she said, "music leaves echoes, especially when it's not allowed to finish." And somewhere, faint and trembling like a breath caught between rooms, a single note seemed to stir in the air, not heard, but felt. Rain came again that night, not as a whisper, but as a steady rhythm, drumming against the glass panes and soaking the earth that had remained untouched for far too long. The ash grove darkened early, its branches weaving together like hands trying to hide something. But this time, the garden did not sleep. By morning, the ground had shifted. It was the youngest gardener, nervous, apologetic, who stumbled upon it. A shallow dip near the oldest ash tree, just enough to suggest something unnatural. The soil caved inward with almost no resistance. Beneath it a hollow, and within that hollow fragments. Not bones, not yet, but enough to still the breath. A cracked hair comb, a piece of torn ribbon, once crimson, now mud-brown, the warped rim of a violin case, and just beside it, the end of a brittle, time-worn string, looped in a circle, like a noose laid gently to rest. They didn't scream. Not the boy. Not Fletcher. Not even Lady Agnes, who arrived moments later with her shawl drawn tight and eyes that refused to blink. "Disturb nothing," she ordered, voice calm but dry. "It could be an animal." Miss Marple had already arrived. She didn't speak. She only knelt, one hand pressed lightly to the damp bark of the ash tree, as though listening to something far older than words. Then, without looking up, she said, "This was placed here. Not discarded. Not by accident." Lady Agnes stiffened. "You're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Marple said quietly, "that someone thought the music would never be heard again. That silence was safer." Helena stepped forward. Her hands were shaking, but she did not hide them. She looked directly at her mother. Did she suffer? Agnes didn't flinch. She was unwell. She was in love. Agnes's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. The wind picked up then a single, sighing gust that passed through the grove and lifted the ends of the ribbon ever so slightly, enough to see that it had once been tied into a bough. Marple rose slowly. "Some people disappear, but they don't vanish. They remain. In roots, in memories, in music that dares to survive." No one moved, and then Fletcher, quiet and forgotten at the edge of the grove, spoke for the first time. "I heard it," he whispered. "Last week, before the first rain. Violin. Soft. Sad. From under the ground." Helena turned to him. "You buried her." He shook his head. "I found her. Years ago. But I was told not to speak. They said the past must stay buried, that it was kinder that way." Helena's voice cracked, not in rage, but in release. "No," she said. "It was convenient." And with that, the silence finally broke. The rain had stopped, but the air still hung heavy, as though the wind itself was holding back a secret. Everything on the grounds of Mayhew Hall appeared unchanged. Yet that morning, something was undeniably different. Fletcher was missing. He hadn't shown up at breakfast. No one had seen him trimming the rose hedges. There was only a single boot, half sunken in mud beside his shed, soaked, forgotten, like it had been left in the middle of something urgent or something final. Miss Marple did not ask permission. She requested the key and quietly opened the gardener's shed. The lock was old, and the hinges groaned, not from age, but from reluctance. Inside, the room was as orderly as one would expect from a man like Fletcher. Pots stacked by size, twine wrapped in even coils, pruning shears wiped clean. But among it all, tucked between worn gardening books, was a leather-bound notebook, small, cracked at the spine, and slightly singed along one edge. Someone had tried to destroy it, but hadn't succeeded. There was no title, no name on the cover, only pages filled with tightly written thoughts, Fletcher's handwriting, nervous yet deliberate. "She cries only when it rains." The third tree, The twisted one. That's where it starts. They took her voice, then her name, then buried both. And over, one name returned. Eleanor. Sometimes underlined, sometimes followed by question marks. Once, written plainly beneath a sentence that made Marple's breath catch. Still beneath us. Miss Marple closed the notebook gently. Her eyes held that particular stillness, the kind that comes not from shock, but from quiet understanding. Fletcher had known the truth. Perhaps he never told anyone, but he had written it. Carefully, desperately. Truth written down never really stays buried, not forever. That same evening, Helena arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Soaked from the drizzle, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her coat undone. She looked exhausted, but her eyes glimmered with something new, a kind of quiet fire. "I used to sneak into that shed when I was little," she said. "He always knew I was there watching. He watched me too, not to spy, but to protect. But he never told me anything." Marple placed a warm hand on Helena's shoulder. "Fletcher kept the truth alive, Helena, not by speaking, but by writing. And written truth doesn't stay buried forever." The storm returned on the third night, not with fury, but with purpose, steady, unrelenting, as though the heavens themselves had resolved to wash the truth clean from stone and skin alike. Rain tapped against the windows of Mayhew Hall like a metronome, measuring the seconds before everything unraveled. Miss Marple requested a gathering. No one dared refuse. The drawing-room was dimly lit, firelight casting soft shadows across aged wallpaper and family portraits whose eyes no longer seemed so lifeless. Lady Agnes entered first, composed and poised, with a scarf draped elegantly around her shoulders. Helena followed, silent but calm, holding something in her hands, something wrapped in a linen cloth. The cook and butler stood near the doorway, their presence quiet but unmissable. And then came silence, long and stiff. Marple began not with accusation, but with questions. Soft, direct, measured. "Why was Eleanor's music forbidden?" she asked, looking not at one person, but all of them. "Why did Fletcher write her name again and again in a notebook meant never to be seen? Why does guilt sleep lighter than grief?" No one answered at first. Lady Agnes's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair, knuckles pale beneath the lace of her gloves. The cook lowered her eyes. The fire cracked. Helena stepped forward. She didn't run. She didn't leave. She was taken, and then buried like she never existed. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "Fletcher found her. Years ago. But he stayed silent, just like the rest of you." Lady Agnes's lips parted, just slightly, but she said nothing. The fire's glow flickered across her features, revealing not rage or denial, but fear. "I was told to forget her," Helena continued, "to smile when her name was avoided, to believe that silence was protection." Marple gently gestured toward the bundle in Helena's hands. She unwrapped it. 2 gloves, one old and worn, the other newer, pristine. Both the same size. Both from the same woman. "I found these buried beneath the ash grove," she said. "One deep, one shallow, years apart. Which one of you returned to the scene?" Again silence. And then, without warning, Lady Agnes stood. Slowly, with dignity sharpened like a blade. Her voice, when it came, was cool and practiced. "She brought shame into this house," she said. "Music, yes, but worse than that. She fell in love with someone beneath her, and she refused to end it." Helena didn't flinch. "So you ended her instead." "She became unwell. She became inconvenient." Agnes's silence was answer enough. Marple watched the room as the weight of long-buried decisions settled over it like a second storm. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the soft tapping of rain against glass, as if Eleanor herself were listening, waiting for someone to finally speak the truth aloud. Miss Marple stood. Silence does not heal. It hides, and when it hides too long it rots. No one argued. That night, Mayhew Hall did not sleep. Where once the earth had been hard-packed and brittle with age, covered in creeping moss and the slow decay of neglect, the rain had softened everything. The soil, freshly stirred by storm and confession, had breathed something new to life. And from that loosened earth, beneath the third ash tree, the twisted one from Fletcher's notes, a bloom had emerged. Not many. Just one. White. Fragile. Its stems shaking in the early wind as though uncertain whether it should rise or fall. A survivor, perhaps. Or a witness. Helena stood near it, arms crossed loosely, her coat draped unevenly across her shoulders. She hadn't cried. Not last night, not this morning. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence spoke in waves. The garden wept on her behalf, its petals heavy, its leaves shivering with memory. Everything around her, alive or not, seemed to bow slightly under the weight of what had been buried, and what had now come to light. By midday, the story had begun to ripple across the village, not with gossip, but with a respectful hush, the sort of quiet that comes when even those uninvolved feel the pull of something sacred. The constable arrived, not in haste, but in solemn formality. There were no handcuffs, no dramatic questions. He came only to take the names, the dates, the pieces that made up an inquest the law required, though everyone present already knew what the verdict would be. The truth had already taken root. Later that afternoon, under a sky still bruised from the earlier storm, the ash grove was finally tended. Not destroyed, not erased, just cleared. The thicket that had once guarded the heart of the grove, like a jealous secret, was carefully trimmed back. Wild branches were cut, weeds pulled. The twisted tree, the one whose roots had wrapped around Eleanor's silence for nearly 2 decades, was left untouched. It remained a monument, not of grief, but of memory. At its base, a space was made, and into that quiet hollow of earth, a stone was placed. No statue, no gilded nameplate, just a smooth, pale river stone, chosen for its shape, not its shine. On it, carved not by artisans, but by hand, were the only words that mattered now. Eleanor Mayhew, loved in silence, remembered in bloom. Helena knelt beside it, her hand reached toward the ground, brushing away a single petal that had fallen across the engraving like a kiss from the wind. From within her coat, she removed a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it with trembling fingers, not from cold, but from a weight long carried. Inside was a brooch, dulled now by time, a treble clef, once worn proudly by a woman who had dared to play music when silence had been demanded of her. Helena placed it gently beside the stone, letting her fingertips rest on it for a moment longer than necessary. Then she leaned in and whispered something no one else could hear, not even Marple, who stood a few steps away watching. Marple said nothing. She didn't need to. Her gaze held no judgment, only reverence. She had not come to solve this. She had come to witness it, the way only the old and wise know how, not with fanfare, but with quiet presence. She watched as Helena stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, her shoulders a little straighter now, her face softer. Together, they looked down at the stone, 2 women from different worlds, bound by one that had been silenced. There were no speeches, no apologies offered, none requested. There were no violins. But in the air, in the hush that followed them, there was music, not loud, not even fully formed, but there, in the trembling of the leaves, in the sigh of the trees, in the parting of clouds, a melody not heard with the ears, but with the soul. "She's not angry," Helena said quietly, as though confirming a conversation that had already happened between her and something unseen. "No," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft, steady, certain. She never wanted revenge, only to be remembered. The morning after the burial arrived with that particular stillness only known to small villages after a storm, a silence not born of peace, but of something exhausted. St. Mary Mead had resumed its quiet routines, each one as familiar as the creak of a cupboard or the whistle of a kettle. The postmistress, unaware or perhaps unwilling to dwell on what had passed, hummed softly to herself as she sorted envelopes, the rhythm of her fingers unbroken. The grocer, brushing rainwater from his stoop, looked up only once at the sky, as though daring it to misbehave again. The church bell rang exactly on the hour, not a minute too soon, not a second too late, and yet it felt different, lighter, hollowed out somehow, as if it too had released something. In a modest cottage tucked behind rose hedges and a weathered gate, Miss Marple sat quietly in her drawing room. A fresh cup of tea had gone lukewarm beside her. She hadn't touched it. Her gaze was fixed not on her knitting or the window view she so often studied, but on a small, weather-stained notebook bound with twine. Fletcher's notebook, its edges still singed where someone, perhaps him, perhaps someone else, had once tried and failed to destroy it. It lay now like a closed confession, not loud, not dramatic, but irrevocable. She had read it twice, once to collect the facts, once more to absorb the grief, and now a third time. She simply let it sit in silence, because she knew the truth does not live only in ink. It breathes in the spaces between, in pauses, in the lines that waver halfway through a sentence, in the way a name is written differently from one page to the next. She thought about the why, not the how, not the who. Those answers had revealed themselves, like ink bleeding through old linen, slow, inevitable. But it was the why that haunted her, because that's what always did. Motive was not just justice's tool. It was humanity's mirror. People think evil comes with noise, she thought, with weapons, with rage, with broken windows and shouted words. But more often, far more often, it arrives dressed in calm. It comes in the form of teacups placed gently on saucers, in gloves tucked neatly into side drawers, in voices that never raise, but slice all the same. It comes with rules, with politeness, with the need to protect legacies at the expense of souls. She turned slightly, eyes drifting toward the lace-draped window. Beyond the misted glass, the ash grove stood still, solemn as ever, yet lighter now. Not physically, but spiritually, as if the very roots had relaxed their grip on the secret they'd kept so long. For the first time in 20 years, the grove looked unburdened. There had been no arrest, no grand confrontation, no headlines. Lady Agnes still roamed the hallways of Mayhew, her name preserved, her dignity unbroken, her wardrobe unchanged. But her voice, that cold, clipped tone that once sliced through rooms, now trembled faintly at the edges. Her gait had softened, her certainty had worn thin. That was punishment enough. Public shame is sharp, but private guilt it lingers. And Helena, dear, quiet Helena, had begun tending the gardens. Not like Fletcher, not with rituals and notes and season-bound precision, but with instinct, with feeling. She planted things she didn't know the names of. She pulled weeds before they grew too proud. She let wildflowers stay. She let the ash grove breathe. There was something about her that reminded Marple of Eleanor. That same gentleness wrapped around a stubborn spirit. That same music in the way she moved, even without sound. The kind of defiance that never raises its voice but never backs down either. And Fletcher. Well, Fletcher was gone. Some believed he had fled, unable to carry the burden of truth any longer. Others believed someone had made sure he stayed quiet, permanently. But Marple believed something else entirely. She believed he had become part of the garden. Not physically. There were no bones beneath the greenhouse, no footprints in the moss, but in the way the tree stood now. In the way the third ash tree curved not in resistance, but in rest. She believed Fletcher had poured his silence into the earth, and that the earth had kept him. Because real loyalty never announces itself. It doesn't ask for reward. It doesn't write its name on the walls. It simply stays, quietly, faithfully, until it's no longer needed. She reached for her tea. It was cold now, but she didn't mind. On the shelf above her fireplace, nestled between two faded volumes of poetry, one missing a cover, the other water-damaged along the spine, sat a delicate glass frame. Inside, pressed and perfectly preserved, was a single white bloom, picked from beneath the third ash tree. No label, no inscription. She didn't need one. Some names, are remembered best in whispers,